Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining another episode of podcast Constitutional Crisis from activist judges to organized anarchist mobs is our topic for tonight. I'm Carlos. We have Marcus, we have Raul, and we have Harrison. And this is Reality Check Podcast. So we're going to start with Marcus, who's got some good information for everybody. And don't forget, if you like what you're hearing, don't forget below to hit like and subscribe. Let's begin.
All right. My topic for today would be about what can the executive and the legislative branch do if there's a constitutional crisis with activist judges. The problem is twofold. You got an issue with injunctions, and then you get how to deal with activist judges. And I'm going to, and the basic solution is have an injunction court and a bad behavior court. So without getting towards the end, I'm going to talk about some of the nuances and the nomenclatures on about the legal terms, just to make sense, just to have a foundation of what we're going to talk about. So injunctions as a judicial remedy actually came from the English court system, the Court of Chancery, which predates the U.S. legal system. And the judicial court, the federal court, was created in the Judicial Act of 1789. And through that act, it gave the court the authority to issue injunctions. And then the issue of preliminary and permanent injunctions was more solidified with the Federal Rule of Civil Procedure number 65. Okay. When there's an injunction, there are four prongs to test for a preliminary injunction for a plaintiff to demonstrate. One is the likelihood of success based on its merits, irreparable harm, and that would be if there was no injunction granted, what kind of harm that would be that you cannot really compensate monetarily. And then you go to balance of hardship as a third prong. The court must weigh in the potential harm to the plaintiff if the injunction was denied against the potential harm to the defendant, which in this case would be the government, if the injunction is granted. And then you have to balance it out, the court. Then there's a public interest aspect of the fourth prong, where the court must consider whether granting the injunction will be for public interest. Okay. So what kind of effect does this have with this injunction? Then you get this constitutional authority issue, where when you issue nationwide injunctions, people would argue that it exceeds Article 3 powers of the federal courts. Article 3 meaning it's a judiciary branch. And then when you issue injunctions, you broaden the scope for like non-parties because it's affecting everybody else. So instead of being specific to a certain a group, you have far-reaching effects to it. So it's exceeding the power of the judicial. Another aspect is you're deviating from traditional remedies. Where like a recent case with the Supreme Court with Trump versus Casa, it found that nationwide injunctions exceeded the traditional equitable remedies historically available to federal courts and should be limited to specific parties involved in a lawsuit. So going with that, and then you go. It also affects a class action suit. So when you do a broad nationwide injunction, you could also impede the procedures of a class action. And then there's the practical concerns. You got like where litigants would do forum shopping. They would go from one judge to another judge to see what to find them sympathetic to their cause. And that could also raise concerns about judicial impartiality, and that also affects the integrity of the system. And then another aspect, it's called legal development percolation. Percolation. So when when a case goes to the Supreme Court, usually there'll be like a number of other little cases similar to that.
Right.
And when it goes to the court, uh, the judges will like look at other aspects of what the other court systems is talking about. So to get a full perspective of what's going on. But if you do a nationwide injunction, you just have a very limited scope on the argument instead of going through the regular court process. Okay. And then another aspect of practical concern is that it's politicizing the judiciary. Okay. Um, so one of the things that the Trump administration did in the big, like 3 months of his administration, like March 11, 2025, he wrote a memorandum. The Federal Civil Procedures 65, there's a subsection called C where if you're going to issue an injunction, the litigants should have post a bond. Because what if the government wins and there's a cost to not following suit? So a few examples is, the Trump administration wants to fire, just say 5,000 employees. That could be a cost of $100 million a week that the government have to foot up. Then they finally, and then it's determined that the executive power is well within authority. Well, they could be out $300 million for that cost. But if you have a bond where they have to come up with like 10%, then there's an ability to partially recoup that. But the thing is, with the Trump administration, they went for well intentions about, hey, let's try to stop this. Well, the thing about Procedure 65C is that it's up to judicial discretion, and they could waive the bond. So all these cases, like where Abrego Garcia was told to come back, well, that's a cost. The challenging illegals to not go to El Salvador and to detain them, well, that's a cost. Flying them, everything's an opportunity cost. So with that, my take is a good solution is to just have an injunction court. So an injunction court would be more like how a FISA court. There would be like a panel of judges. It could be 3 or it could be more. It could have cover certain geographic areas. And my take is just have a simple go, no go criteria. And that would be like, if it's at the right venue. And when we mean venue, it's the place where the civil cause of action takes place, where the defendant resides or conducts business, or where the problem occurred. Then if it's in the right jurisdiction, so that's the court's authority to hear certain cases. And that kind of would prevent forum shopping. And then I would also add there's no discretion on bonds. That should be mandatory. And then another aspect is if there is a valid constitutional argument, because even though I mentioned that there are 4 prongs for an injunction, a lot of the times, or not a lot, like 100% of the time, Trump wins because it's within the executive authority purview. So they're arguing cases that it's within his right, and they're challenging it when they basically have no way to win it. So again, my take is an injunction court would solve a lot of the problem, because even though there was a decision by the Supreme Court to rule it, you're still getting rogue judges making the cause to injunct or stop what the Trump administration is doing. Okay. Anybody have any questions about it so far?
Yeah, I would ask, the injunction option would be a great way to curtail some of that. How would that be put into effect? Who would initiate that, and how does it get approved? How does it get codified?
that would be the legislative branch. You can't make something out of thin air.
Yeah.
It has to be codified. So the legislative and I forget what hearing it was because of the FISA court was made. It was about
That was during the Bush
about
years. That was during the Bush.
un-American about assassinations. No, that it was in the 70s.
Yeah, okay,
You
you're
know,
right.
where the CIA was conducting
Right.
assassinations, MK Ultra. So then, and then we're spying on civilians. So because of that, that hearing, the legislative branch formulated a FISA court.
Would that be a simple majority or a 60 votes in the House, for example?
It should be a simple majority.
Because yeah, good. Because if it were a super majority, we don't have the numbers, and a lot of we've got three rhino jackasses. Markowski, Collins, who from what I heard is in real trouble, and can't think of the well that's Senate, but in the House, Thomas Massey. Oh, and McConnell is the other one who's on his way out, but he's still around to create resistance.
All right.
Yeah, but I don't know, man. I think it would not be a simple majority. I think that's the reason. That's why, you're seeing everybody's focused on this one big beautiful bill because it is a budgetary item, and the rules are different. When you're dealing with budgetary items, particularly in the Senate, you can pass them with a simple majority, but the reason is, you need at least 60 votes to override a filibuster in the Senate. And, we don't have 60 Republicans in the Senate. So, the Democrats could filibuster any legislative proposal other than a financial proposal indefinitely. That's how come. And I don't think that's going to change in the foreseeable future, quite frankly. I think that's why the president is talking now about doing a second big beautiful bill to sort of address a lot of the stuff that they were unable to sort of get in the first one. But it's going to be using the power of the purse to change policies, where you may be able to completely defund certain organizations or give money to other groups or whatever. But that seems to be, at least for the foreseeable future, the only way that we're going to be able to move the ball legislatively, in Congress. But Marcus, I mean, the shopping of what they call judge shopping, right? Where they find a judge appointed by Obama or Biden who, I mean, look at what they just did today. Planned Parenthood. There was a judge in New York that basically said, no, you can't stop funding Planned Parenthood, right? And so now they're going to have to go to an appeal, and apparently it was a crazy decision. I mean, I was watching that Judge Napolitano, right, who talking about it and said, listen, the woman judge who passed that decision, brought that decision down last night or whatever, or this weekend, was a very respected judge until this very moment, because she can't you can't sort of turn things around, because what ended up happening is, in this latest one big beautiful bill, they put language in there to specifically defund Planned Parenthood, and it said any organization receiving more than X amount of dollars from the U.S. government. They didn't actually say Planned Parenthood, but they put parameters around it that made it pretty evident that they were targeting Planned Parenthood. And this judge said you can't do that. And the point of Judge Napolitano was, listen, legislative action has been taken, and you cannot, as a judge, go back and tell the Congress that they were wrong to pass that law. That's not what judges can do. And so, but again, this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem right now for the Trump administration getting anything passed. And it's tricky territory, because Right now, a lot of us conservatives are upset about it because, Trump's will is being, um, stymied, if you will. But, in a future administration, when the tables are turned, we may be looking for nationwide injunctions of our own, and finding out that, we can no longer do them because, we've changed the rules of the game. But look, I mean, you can't make decisions, anticipating what could happen in the future. I mean, you have to sort of make the best decision in my mind at the time. I mean, you sort of have to keep that in the back of your mind. But this is crazy, man. The whole idea that a judge can basically, tell the president or tell the Congress what to do. I mean, who elected them, right? I mean, judges are not typically elected. I mean, they're appointed. And so, I think that's where the problem lies. And yes, Congress is involved because Congress provides the funding for the judiciary, for the courts throughout the U.S., for the federal courts. So they have a big say in this. But I get what you're saying, Marcus, and I think it absolutely, that's what they've been talking about, either having, injunction courts where you have more than one judge, right? So you have three or four, and you need to have a majority opinion of them or whatever to agree to the injunction, or you need to put up those injunction bonds because you're right. I mean, you could cause enormous damage. You are in essence subverting the will of the president, who was elected in order to control this sort of runaway illegal immigration. And now, if he can't do that, you're subverting the will at the end of the day of the American people who voted for him, right? So something's got to give.
Well, I mean, the reason why I bring it up is even though it might be just a mental exercise, I'm hoping that, with the podcast, it might reach a viewership where you get to the point of a higher level discussion, especially with
Right.
elected officials.
Right.
So, you get individuals thinking outside the box, and then you get like a senator like, oh, I like that idea, or somebody in the administration, I like this idea. So
Yeah. Let me give you an example of where it can sort of be flipped against us or for us, whatever. And I think this, Marcus, because I don't know if Harrison or Carlos, this, but several years ago, I sued my own municipality down here, the city of Coral Gables, over these automatic license plate readers that really are incredibly obtrusive. They keep track of where you're going during the course of the day. In the case of the city of Coral Gables, they were keeping those records for like 5 years, even though you hadn't done anything wrong, right? I mean, the cameras capture everybody. It can cast a very wide net. And then those records are just archived forever. And the computers automatically determine based on your license number whether you're a criminal or you're wanted for this or for that. And so I was represented in that lawsuit by a very serious group called the New Civil Liberties Alliance. It's based out of Washington, D.C. And the fellow who founded the New Civil Liberties Alliance is actually the guy who has been leading the charge nationwide against the abuses of administrative judges that, we've created this enormous bureaucracy of administrative judges to interpret, what the laws in fact say, and in essence have given enormous power to government bureaucrats all throughout the country. Now, that recent decision that you guys heard about where they did away with the Chevron deference, which basically gave a lot of that power to the administrative justices, is, beginning to scale back a lot of that abuse of administrative power throughout the country. So that's a good thing. And that charge has been led not just by the New Civil Liberties Alliance, but by a lot of other groups throughout the U.S. But the reason I bring it up is because one of the things that this group is now involved with, NCLA, is they are challenging the president's power to arbitrarily set tariffs, because their argument is, and I think it's on solid legal. Again, I'm not a lawyer; I don't pretend to be one, but what I've read is that that they are in fact on solid legal ground. That if you read carefully how Congress was set up, that power to impose tariffs actually belongs to Congress and not the president.
Marcus,
Uh,
I want to mention something.
no, just to counter your point, Raul,
Yeah.
because my initial idea was about incorporating the National Emergency Act. So, and he could, as a president, he could use that for tariff purposes.
Right.
So
Right.
when there's like 100, literally 150 emergency powers with a combination of the president or by Congress or certain situations that could be invoked. Okay, part of
Right.
it could be for public health. There's like a COVID crisis, they could shut down the airports, and then there's like a land management, national security issues, to deal with federal employees and military. Like we need to hire so many more admirals or generals, blah blah blah. And then there's criminal persecution and detainment powers. So with tariffs, there's been situations where the president would say, "Well, we're doing an embargo against Iran."
Right.
Since 1979, that's been ongoing. So as a president, to counter maybe that lawsuit, the president could invoke emergency powers.
Right.
And the only way to override that is two ways. Either the legislative is where it's veto proof overrides a national emergency. That means you have to get Republicans and Democrats, which is unlikely if it's a tariff issue, or go through the court and do an injunction.
Yeah.
So the Constitution grants the federal government the right to regulate commerce, which means, in the context of our founding, the right to create a national currency, for example, so that every state wasn't issuing their own. But to Marcus's point, what we've seen with the tariffs is that these are being used as very effective weapons of soft power that fall under national security. So, for example, we've discovered that we've offshored a lot of manufacturing that suddenly leave us vulnerable in case of a major military engagement.
Yeah. Look at shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is a prime example of that, right? I mean, we're not building enough ships. We don't have the capacity for it.
Shipbuilding, semiconductors. Yeah. So no. To your point, that's how you make the executive argument. This is not strictly a commercial endeavor. This is being used to affect our national security and international relations around the globe. So when you hit China with who we're effectively in Cold War II with right now, when you hit them with tariffs, that falls now under a national security practice, which would be under the executive purview.
Yeah.
So I think that's how you get around that.
Yeah.
They've certainly been wielding it with astonishing effectiveness. I was one of those so-called free traders who kind of misinterpreted what his intention was when the administration began, and I was skeptical of it. And a lot of people I respected were skeptical of it, but he's turned out to be right. I mean, it's working extremely well. And we'll see where it goes from here. Raul, you're much more well-versed on that than I am. But in terms of the constitutionality of it.
No, listen, the point that I'm trying to make is that there are some issues that, do in fact rise to, that's why the courts exist, right? I mean, that there's this tension between the different branches of government, Congress and the executive branch, whatever. And that's why you have, that the court system to resolve some of those issues. And thankfully in this country, we also have a lot of different advocacy groups, some which we may despise, others that we like, right? But everybody has that ability to say, raise your hand and say, wait a second, you can't do that, or you can't get away with that, or you have to consider this, you have to consider that. But Harrison, I mean, I'm all with you, man. I mean, this there are a lot of issues here involved that go far beyond just simple, buying the shit that we purchase in Walmart or Costco or whatever. I mean, there are real national security implications behind this. Chips, shipbuilding, outsourcing of jobs, and I'm reminded. I talk about this all the time, and I'm reminded of. I don't know if you guys remember that guy, Ross Perot with the big ears, right? When he ran for president, I guess, or
92.
92, right? And he had a Navy admiral. Remember Harrison?
Stockdale.
Admiral Stockdale.
Who am I? Where am I?
Running it. And I remember that, he said during those debates, because he was on a couple of debates at one point, and this was during the whole period of time when these free trade agreements were being negotiated, right? The free trade agreement with Mexico, the opening up China's to the rest of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember distinctly Ross Perot saying that the minute, before the ink dries, after you sign those documents, you're going to hear this enormous sucking sound, and it's going to be the sound of American jobs leaving the U.S. and going overseas. And you know what? In retrospect, he was 110% right? And, for me, it took me, quite frankly, years to sort of realize that a lot of the stuff that I had been taught in college, because I studied economics, right? I mean, basically economic theory tells you that, you should allow countries that have, lower wages to concentrate their efforts in, building simple stuff, right? Which would generate, relatively modest profits that would allow them to develop. And we, America, as a developed country, should focus on building, big Boeing, international aircraft, $200 million each one, et cetera, et cetera. But what that pure economic theory failed to recognize was the impact that it would have on jobs in America and our national security and a host of different things that if you were simply looking at it from the standpoint of a free market person, right? Because the Republican Party has historically been in favor of free markets. It didn't work out that way, guys. You can't make all your decisions based on, what some economist said 100 years ago, or, Adam Smith or whatever, right? I mean, you have to take a look at the reality of your country. You have to take a look at the people that you're serving, and you have to take a look at your adversaries as well.
Well,
Yeah. So
also,
good.
Perot also missed. I want to touch on when Raul just said, but Perot only got half of it. He missed another sucking sound, but that one came from the Oval Office. I think we know what that was all about. Now,
Go down there. Let's go there, Carlos.
all humor aside, they also, I believe, Raul underestimated. This is 92, and the following decades to come, how quickly, aggressively
Sure.
China would mobilize their industries,
Sure.
and would exploit and pound
Yeah.
on that issue, on the vulnerability. Oh, you want outsourcing? No problem, America. We give you outsourcing. And that's, I think they had underestimated. Yes, Harrison.
Well, this is just kind of a thought experiment, and it's just sort of dovetailed under the Ross Perot discussion. But I found it interesting over the past 8 years, and I'm not talking about whether people are Democrat or Republican or who they voted for. This is directed at the people with Trump derangement syndrome, the people who viscerally just hate him. And I know a lot of these people, and I remember how fervently they jumped on the Ross Perot bandwagon in 92. And I've gone back and asked every one of them, what's the difference? I mean, the two of them have different temperaments, but how do you distinguish Trump's platform from Ross Perot's? They were almost identical.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
Trump renegotiated NAFTA. Trump was against the Iraq War. Ross Perot was against Desert Storm, for God's sake.
Mm-hmm.
every aspect. And Trump also, by the way, told American companies if they were going to take advantage of labor in Mexico, they were going to have to pay the workers a living wage if they wanted to resell back into the United States.
Yeah.
Now, you would think that would make liberals happy, but it didn't. But I'm just putting that out there as an interesting question. Ask when you run across these people who just hate him with this irrational kind of emotion, and yet they were gung ho for Perot back in '92. Just ask them, what's the difference?
Right.
And I've never gotten an answer. Usually, what I get is, "Well, that was so long ago, I don't even remember."
Yeah.
And I'm not making this up. And these are smart people, very smart people. But in this
Book
case,
smart.
well, that's a whole nother alley we can go down.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's exactly. It's the
Going
Marcus.
going with the thought about being book smart and about theory, about economic theory and free trade. Uh, Everything is kind of believable until you stress test the position or the argument. And this concept of free trade, allowing China and going to Ross Perot's position was more salient when COVID happened, when everything was shut down, then we were realized, wow, we're heavily reliant on China on all this stuff, like from masks, pharmaceuticals, and then and other products. And then when it came down to asking China, hey, can you send some of the stuff? And they said no. And that was like a big eye opener about national security concerns in terms of various industries,
Right.
that we left ourselves vulnerable.
Right. Yeah, because
Marcus,
those were viewed as industries that didn't really have, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, look, got some bandages here on top of my desk, right? All made in China, right? I mean, any sort of, tape, things of this sort, medical supplies, so much of that stuff, just pharmaceuticals, it all went to these foreign countries with low wages, and textiles as well, right? I mean, we lost all the capability. We had huge textile plants in New England and in the Carolinas. All of those disappeared, in the course of a few years. A lot of the steel plants, a lot of steel manufacturing. That's why you have the Rust Belt now in the Midwest, right? All that stuff disappeared. And the big thing that they failed to realize is, okay, this is great. And I think what Americans have reluctantly realized, this is wonderful that I can walk into a Costco or a BJ's or a Walmart and I can buy a 7-foot wide television for $500. Okay. But what has been the cost to the country, okay, of having all that cheap crap at Walmart, okay, at the expense of all of these jobs and all this national income that was sent overseas. And we ignored an enormous segment of the population that was suddenly left unemployed, okay? Now, you can make the argument, I've always made the argument, look, I mean, that's where Republicans and Democrats failed. Perot was right. That sucking sound, all those jobs went overseas. And guess what? We did not, as a country, play an active role in making sure that these textile workers or these coal miners, okay, would still be able to work or find employment. You remember Biden a couple of years ago said, well, the coal miners ought to go to California and learn how to code, right? I mean, that was right? Bullshit, right? I mean, you can't. People are immobile. You've got people that grow up in communities and neighborhoods. You can't pack them up from one day to the other and move them to California or some other part of the country and reinvent themselves. That takes a generation, 2-3 generations to do that kind of stuff. And that's where we failed as a country because, getting back, Marcus, to what you were saying, economic theory is great, but when you stress it and you realize, well, wait a second, now we have all these other issues that are coming out as a result of that. Yeah, it's great that I can go to Walmart and I can buy a 7-foot, wide television for $500, but there's some real costs that come along with that. And I think Americans have finally woken up to that and are saying, man, this is really, not good for us.
Maybe some Americans. Marcus.
I'm going to pantomime. I'm going to do this. It's called the fishing. I'm going to fish it back to the topic.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that topic before you keep reeling it in there, before you pull up the line in the sinker. I remember Biden, and you gentlemen correct me if I'm wrong, but anytime anytime a judge tried to injunction Biden, he or whoever his puppet masters were wiped their ass with that judge. Why does not Trump wipe his ass with these judges?
That's been going on for a while. The party in power ignores, in the case of Biden, remember, he was making out a whole cloth. He just decided to pardon all those student loans, right? Wait a second, where did you get that authority?
Well, yeah, Raul, it was actually much worse than that. It did go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said,
right,
you can't do that.
And they did it anyway.
Do it anyway.
Right.
I think that's unprecedented.
Yeah.
Unless we go back to before the Civil War, I can't think of any time that's been done.
Yeah, he literally, thumbed his nose at the Supreme Court, and he said it. If I recall correctly, he even mentioned it, or one of his, top persons mentioned it. Said, yeah, we disagree with the court. Yeah.
Well, Trump has a much greater mandate than Biden could ever dream of. Why does he not do the same thing? That's my question. Why does he not do the same thing? What are they going to do to him? Impeach him?
Because everything he does is under a microscope. Everything gets hyper scrutinized compared to a Democratic president. So it's
by a party that's 30%, Marcus, but by a party that's 30% approval and a media that's closing down.
Well, the Congress, the courts do have the right to determine, even if Congress has passed legislation. That was, I think, Marbury versus Madison way back in the beginning. That the courts are set up to determine if the case has to have merit. But if it does, then it's up to them to determine if that law was passed in accordance with the Constitution. But that's really not, that would usually go up to the Supreme Court. So these local judges are just holding things up without merit and without cause. But the other thing I want to add, I think that, but on the flip side of that is that in terms of strategy, that's why the Trump administration has been moving at breakneck speed. They're getting all this done because they know that eventually a lot of it is going to end up being adjudicated. And some of it will go all the way up to SCOTUS. And if it does go to SCOTUS, that will probably land on the side of the administration. Not necessarily, but more than likely. But they've had that in mind all along. That's why they hit the ground running even before Inauguration Day.
Marcus, you want to go ahead and finish pulling in the fish?
Yeah, I'm gonna do the segue thing.
Yeah.
All right. So the second part is I'm gonna talk about like activist judges. Okay. So I guess one definition would be a judge cannot be a neutral arbiter of disputes if they intend to rewrite the law at the outset of a case, if they are guided by their own policy preferences rather than the faithful interpretation of the law or legislating from the bench. Okay. So Madison under Federalist 47 made the same point. He says the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one, few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny.
Yeah.
Okay. So going to Alexander Hamilton under Federalist 78, he viewed judges as lifetime appointments if they are in good behavior, and that was incorporated into the Constitution under Article 3, Section 1 for good behavior. Okay. So I guess one way we should define go through this is define good behavior and bad behavior. So at the very minimum baseline for good behavior is justice delayed is justice denied. The law favors transparency. The law favors equality. And sham dispositions result by ignoring settled rules of evidence. Okay, that's for good behavior. And for bad behavior, I'll look at it as a judicial misbehavior and judicial malfeasance. Okay, lack of fidelity to the Constitution, laws, or statute, and I added incompetence. Okay, and violation of constitutional and judicial ethics, and introducing unfairness to the court, and I would hyphen or asterisk Justice Samuel Chase for that. He was the only justice to be impeached, and the reason being is he was introducing unfairness to the court. When he was a lower court judge, he would make up his own rules, and when he became a Supreme Court justice, he was all about fidelity. So that was like a level of hypocrisy that other people couldn't stomach.
Yeah.
So, like, what's the effects of bad behavior? You get like the abuse of discretion, and that's a legal term where a judge makes a decision that is unreasonable or arbitrary that falls outside the bounds of a reasonable person would consider acceptable. And that abuse of discretion is used as a standard by higher courts when they review lower court decisions or administrative agencies, and when it involves exercise of discretion. And so a good example would be about Trump and insurrection. He says peacefully and protest, but the way like some of the courts interpreted that was proof of an insurrection. Yeah. I mean, that was like a wide leap of causality from one point to the other. I mean, we could stress test the argument like, does cat juggling equate to treasonous behavior? Just if you want to go in ridiculousness.
Whenever I hear the real quick pause, pardon me. Whenever I hear that insurrection BS, I always say it's interesting. If you committed murder, and they knew you committed murder, and they were convinced they could find you guilty, you would be first of all charged with murder. You would be tried for murder, and you would be probably convicted of murder, and then you would serve the time. Now, in the case of insurrectionists, all these people that were kept in a dungeon for 4 years, not a single one was ever tried for insurrection, charged with, tried for, or convicted of insurrection. So that whole argument is bullshit, basically. I've never seen an answer for that.
It was trespassing and interfering with government activities or something like that.
But not insurrection. They love to use the term.
There are misdemeanors, pretty much.
Yeah. Insurrection is not a misdemeanor. I'm pretty sure, right? I'm sure that's a far greater offense in magnitude. Anyway, just, it's a point I use. It's a tactic I use when I get the Kool-Aid drinkers. And they can usually never articulate the argument.
And if you want to see a picture of an insurrectionist, look at the Taliban with AK-47s at the Afghan palace.
Yeah.
After we left.
Yeah.
That's an insurrection.
Yeah.
Another one is like lawful. Yeah. Another one would be like lawful suppression of evidence, where the judge rejects evidence outright when maybe find it inadmissible due to a violation of the Constitution or other statute, where evidence is excluded. And then there's a thing called error of law, where the judge in your case applied the wrong rule or standard to the facts in your case. And then it could be the erroneous application of law, where they misapplied a legal rule or standard. And then you could look at that with in New York about Trump and property taxes and loans. They resurrected statutes that didn't apply to Trump, and it was outside of the statutory period, and they made a law just to fit the crime.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that was never intended. They knew that could never hold up under legal scrutiny. It would be overturned. The whole purpose of that was to smear him, damage him enough so that he'd be a defective candidate, a damaged candidate who could not win. Speaking of the judge on good behavior, who determines the judge's good or bad behavior?
Well, my solution is to have a bad behavior court with a panel of judges to determine that. And
Right.
that's why I'm defining some of the bad behaviors
Hmm.
that you see. So I treat it like a speeding ticket, like having a ticket for your license. If you accumulate so many licenses, you get suspended.
Points.
I figured the same rule should apply for judges if they go in front of a bad behavior court, where I'm giving an arbitrary number, like just say 15 or 18 points. It's not renewable. If they accumulate 15 to 18 points, and that could be like 3 bad decisions, depending on the severity on what they're infringing upon. And then they could be impeached for bad behavior. And the thing is, I think it's a good way because right now judges believe they're above the law or above reproach, and that they develop a level of arrogance where their word or is the law without the law backing it up. So and yeah, so I figure like you could have like a bad day and say, hey, well, you did a law where it just it was a bad choice, but it didn't even have any constitutional merits to it. And then you get 3 points. Those 3 points that judge is going to remember, and that would have a cooling effect with other judges.
Mhm.
Well,
And that's my take on as a solution. And
not remember the Duke Lacrosse farce, which was a complete farce. Nobody raped anybody. When they tested that woman, she had about 4 or 5 different samples in her of DNA, none of which belonged to the 3 boys. That DA, who's I don't remember his first name, but it was Mike Nifon, he was disbarred. So he only needed one offense to get his ass disbarred, and he did that. Remember, he blocked exculpatory evidence like that particular evidence because he was courting the black vote in an upcoming reelection for
well,
district attorney.
look at the Trump rape case, something that
There you
happened like
go.
40, 50 years ago.
Yeah,
There's no proof. He said, she said, and he was fined like whatever $500 million
Yeah, it's crazy,
outside
crazy.
of.
yeah, he's got to eventually take that back. Are we ready to go on to the next step of this?
No, listen, I just want to make an observation here, man. This past weekend, I turned 68. Okay, I've lived in this
Congratulations.
country for 65 of those 68 years, and all this conversation reminds me, and I'm sure you guys probably share this, man. I mean, when we were growing up, I used to believe in, the courts. I used to believe in our legislative process. I used to believe that government bureaucrats were folks that really they served every administration the same way. There was no bias. That judges were unimpeachable. And I got to tell you, man, now that I've got gray hair or no hair, I've finally realized. I remember when I was young, some of the older folks that I used to, you know, hang around with would sort of, wag their fingers at me and say, "Just you wait until you get a little bit older, you little whippersnapper, and you find out how the world really works, right?" And guess what? I have found out that the world is not and things in America and how our democracy works. Um, it's not pretty. It's far from perfect. It is flawed in many different ways. It is in big need of reforms at a variety of different levels, but it's still, compared to the rest of the world, the best that we have, and
Yep.
far better than practically any other country on earth. And just one last point, man. I remember, one of my closest friends down here in Miami, the gentleman who spent many, many years in law enforcement, one of the biggest departments down here, really reached almost the pinnacle of the organization. He finally retired. And I remember one time, he's obviously as a police officer spent a lot of time in, courts and whatnot. And one day he told me, he says, Raul, you know what the biggest lie in America is? I said, what's that? He said, it's those words that you see anytime that you walk into a judge's chamber. There's a sign in practically every courthouse in America that says, all of us who labor here seek only the truth.
Yeah,
And
right.
never forget his words to me was, that is the biggest crock of shit that you've ever heard. It doesn't, it's a fantasy land. All those lawyers, the judges, they all have their own biases. Everybody's in there. They have their own angles. They're trying to, beat you out for one thing or another. But the truth is, the objective truth is very, very hard to find. And judges have their own political biases. Attorneys have their own political biases. Political parties, obviously, that's why we have this adversarial relationship between Democrats and Republicans. But man, I've learned that now, I mean, it's I grew up with rose-colored glasses on me, and now I've got these old fogey readers on, but I see a hell of a lot clearer than I did when I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s.
Well, in fairness to you, Raul, I think that it's true that things have gotten worse in our lifetime. And, we won't go down this rabbit hole tonight, but we've talked about the infiltration of the universities and the propagation of neo-Marxist ideas among the students as propagated by the faculty. That's been nowhere as apparent as in our elite law schools. And one of the tenets of neo-Marxism is that there is no objective truth. That's the new postmodern concept. Everyone has their own truth. Now that sort of relativism has been infecting our institutions our entire life.
I blame it on the hippies, Harrison. I blame it on the hippies.
So do I.
We love all that relativism.
No. George Will once said that there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who think there was something worthwhile about the 60s, and those who don't.
Yeah.
And I think you could certainly put us in the latter group. There's also one old chestnut that says that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged, and a liberal is a conservative who's been unjustly arrested.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think that gets to your point about how we grew up believing in everything American, but the corruption of the judicial system has been perhaps one of the hardest to take of all.
It is.
Before I start,
the courts are your sort of it's your backstop, right? It's the backstop
supposed to be
everything about our way of life, right? I mean, and by the way, looking at it as a banker, I mean, you look. One of the reasons why we've been able to get away with this 36 trillion in debt, okay, and we've been able to accumulate, all those borrowings and all that stuff for decades now, is because one of the things that the investment community looks at, both here in the U.S. and certainly overseas, when they're looking at a currency, is, what are the court systems like? Can I if I have my property confiscated in America, okay, do I have a right, to redress my grievances? Can I go to court and say, hey, wait a second, this was taken away from me unfairly, and I'm, I don't want to belittle the point, but our judicial system is part of the bedrock of our financial system as well. It's all integrated. And our legislative process, the fact that we are a functioning democracy with all of its warts and failures and biases and everything else, that is what really underpins the entire American economy and free market capitalism and and why people want to invest in America, because they still believe, and the only thing that they have to base their faith on is a one sentence phrase that says, the U.S. dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. There's no gold there anymore backing that up. Yeah, we got some gold left over in Fort Knox, but certainly not enough to collateralize $36 trillion, right? But once that goes away, once the institutions start to fray, once they start to, be seen as suspect by the rest of the world, then we're in trouble.
Well
Right,
said.
before I get into my piece of this tonight, I just wanted to touch briefly, real quick, roll two things. The traffic camera thing. You probably remember Representative. He worked for Trump in the first administration, Carlos Trujillo.
Yeah.
Okay, I was his legislative contact dentist, super nice kid, and he had a bugaboo about those cameras, man. That was his mission. That was his crusade, and he got smacked down, and he was very dejected. I said, Carlos, why? What happened? He goes, oh man, those cities, no way, it's never happening. They're just too damn addicted to the revenue from the cameras.
Well, listen, no, we lost that case, and the reason we lost that case, and it went to appeal. We took it to the local appellate courts, but the standard for the law today, and it's we were arguing that it's completely antiquated, is that the minute you step outside your front door, you no longer have a right to privacy. Once you leave the confines of your house, okay, you no longer have a right to privacy. And the argument that we were making is, and we were trying to prove it in court, right? I mean, look, if you know what time I leave my house, where I go during the course of the day, where I have breakfast, where I go for lunch, when I go to my doctor's appointment, when I go back to my office, you basically have a pattern of life. You know exactly everything that I'm doing in the course of the day. And you are, in essence, you have private information about me simply because you've gathered this stuff and it's sitting someplace, by the way, with a private company that provides these camera searching functions for all these municipalities and state governments, and that's wrong, right? And you're seeing it now also, obviously, with our computers, right? I mean, people laugh about how, oh, gee, I mean, this new generation, this whole idea of privacy. Quite frankly, I was surprised it really didn't resonate with this younger generation, the importance of privacy. Why? Because they grew up with this, and there is no privacy when you're on this phone and you're giving them all your information. You're having to input your credit card numbers, and everybody has a profile, and you can see about everybody's life, and they post all these pictures about where they've been, and it's all been geotagged. And so this generation has grown up with no understanding of why it's important to have privacy, why you don't want to have people knowing where you're going all day long, right? And I remind them that great film, which I'm sure you guys probably saw, about the East German Stasi, right? The Lives of Others, I think was the name of the movie.
Great movie.
Which a phenomenal movie that showed East Germany, and back when they were eavesdropping on practically the entire population, right? And that thankfully is now a relic of history. But the amount of surveillance that is out there these days is unbelievable, especially now these facial recognition technologies, right? I mean, it makes your life easier. I can sign into my iPhone a lot easier because, got facial recognition. But that's how China controls people. I mean, they've got cameras all over the place. You go to Europe, there's cameras all over the place, and they have facial recognition technologies. And it's the 1984 is here, guys. It's not.
Yeah.
It's been here for a while, and it's just getting worse, right? So anyway, we're sort of like.
By the way, Stasi may be gone, okay, but the German Polizei can come knock on your apartment door, as I saw in a recent 60 Minutes piece, and arrest you because you published a cartoon that offended some people, particularly if you spoke out against the Islamization. The last thing on the judges, we had a dentist slash attorney, hilarious speaker, very sharp guy, and he was giving us a jurisprudence course for our requirements for renewing license. And he said, "Oh, you dentists, my brothers, I and sisters, I love you guys. You want to have your day in court, and you're going to get your lawyer, and you're going to beat that patient with that frivolous lawsuit." I'm going to tell you why that's not a good idea. And I'm going to tell you by asking two simple riddles. What's the definition of a juror? And everybody gave all these perfect answers. And he goes, "Nope, nope, you're all wrong. Definition of a juror: a person too damn stupid to get out of jury duty." Okay, and the next one, what do you call an attorney whose IQ is below 50? The answer, Your Honor.
Yeah.
So let me go on now to the an extension of what Marcus was talking about. I believe that this lawfare that we talked about, and people thought, "Oh, well, Trump won. The lawfare is over." No, the lawfare is not over. The lawfare is simply just morphed into another form, and it is, for example, impeding. They want the votes in those blue states. They need the illegal aliens for census numbers, and with this pipe dream of eventually making them citizens that will vote, and then flip every state and make it virtually impossible for the GOP to win the White House or control the House or Senate. So I'm going to talk about the organizations who are behind. I'm just going to talk with LA in mind. And that's probably, recently we've seen the most of the activity and outrageousness was there. So the first organization I'm going to talk about is called CHIRLA, which means Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles. Does that not sound Orwellian? Who's against humane immigrant rights, right? Well, the IRS Form 990 records, they got 34 million taxpayer money. So you and I, my friends, paid for that just as recent as mid 2023. The DHS grants totaled 450 grand from 21 to 24, even though 100,000 of that was clawed back. So again, this is taxpayer money. And then they got grants from the Ford and Weingart foundations. I don't think it's related to Randy Weingart, but nevertheless, these are foundations. And we talk about Ford built tough, and the American dream, and Henry Ford and the Model T. Well, that's not your grandpa's Ford anymore. Also in LA, you have the LA Justice Fund, which is a private / public. What do they pay for? Rioting, looting, rent-a-mobs, burning property, blocking, assaulting ICE. That was just CHIRLA. Now let's move on to SEIU, which means Service Employees International Union. And before I finish SEIU, I'm going to give a brief anecdote of an experience that I had firsthand with SEIU. Those are union dues funded, i.e., again, Orwellian, Marxist, workers of the world unite. 239 million, with 99% of their donations go to liberals. I'm sure that's just a coincidence that SEIU's donations go 99% to liberals. They also fund the Center for American Progress and National Employment Law Project, both far left outfits. My run-in with the SEIU, you guys remember when Obamacare was going to be voted on, and it was very controversial, and people were out the Tea Party, we were out demonstrating. Well, we were at the office of then Senator Bill Nelson, and it's in Coral Gables, downtown Coral Gables. And we showed up, we found out that he was going to be in his office. It was leaked because he did not want people to know he was going to be in that office, because he knew a protest crowd reform. Very peaceful on one side of the street. Within minutes, and I met people that afternoon that had been, my wife was with me. We met people that had been to several of these similar to this one. Suddenly, a school bus pulls up, opens, and a bunch of people with purple shirts with SEIU in yellow pour out. And one of the guys says, "Up, here comes the rent-a-mob." And I knew what he was talking about. And I said, "Well, do you know this because?" "Oh, because I've seen him a couple of times before." "You watch." And he looks at his watch. He says, "It's 2:40, all right? They'll be here for exactly 1 hour. And at 3:40, they'll be out of here." And they were trying to cross the street and harass us. And there was some guy who was, I don't know if he was part of SEIU. He was dressed like a minister, like a priest, in that heat, insane. And he was coming across to try to egg us on. And there was one lonely Gables PD on a bicycle. And he was trying to keep order. And he kept telling us, "You can't go over there." I said, hey, officer, we can't go over there, but they're coming over here. You got to be fair. This is not right. You know, he says, I know. Please just stand down. Give me a moment. He walked over and he told them, you know, that they couldn't come across the street and harass us and try to egg us on or and you know trigger us. If we were had to stay on our side, they did, and until he did that, then and only then was when they stayed on their side of the street. And sure enough, 1 hour later, the bus came back and they poured in and they left. So this is another rent mob. Uh, let's go to the next one. Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL. That is, remember, this is the common thread here is these are organizations that were funding the rent mobs in LA. They just happen to have identical signs, just happen to have very expensive UVEX gas-proof masks, just happen to have coolers with frozen water bottles, just, you know, happenstance. That's a group that's funding. Then there's the Justice and Education Fund. They got 20 million from a businessman named Roy Neville Singham, software and IT mogul. He has pro-Chinese Communist Party inclinations and connections. And then those are the big three. And then the miscellaneous, the honorable mentions, Antifa affiliated groups are involved, Soros and Open Society Foundations. Now get this one, the CCP, no surprise, and the Mexican government. Mexico would love to dump all those people here and let them stay here and let us support them and let them sway our elections. Now, Kash Patel says the FBI is investigating this last group, but to date, particularly the Justice Education Fund, but there have been no arrests yet. What all these groups have in common is they have Marxist origins or connections or tentacles or inclinations, every single one of them. And the point is to wreak havoc, and they do it mostly in blue states because they know that the police there sometimes are held back. This is not like DeSantis, who will tell us here in Florida, they get in front of your car, you run their ass over. But you can't do that in LA. Actually, people are getting frustrated in doing it. And they're trying to arrest people. So that is yet another part of this lawfare. And I predict the lawfare will be around the entire time. So Trump, Patel, Bondi, Noam, Homan had better sack up and fight this hard and fight this harshly because it's never going to go away. Yes, Marcus.
Just to go along with those points, so kind of like going at the border, the Trump administration is using a multi-agency approach to deal with the immigration and border crisis. So you get the military, you get the Department of Justice, you get the IRS, you get ATF, DEA, using various assets.
National
In terms
Guard.
of National
National
Guard.
Guard, yes.
So in terms of dealing with these organizations, whether they're tied to NGOs or charity organizations, foundations or funds, it should be approached uh, a multi-pronged way that they did with the border and with immigration. Like right now, we're seeing the Department of Justice arresting people
Finally.
with under federal statutes, which has a heftier consequence than just state laws. Okay, so that could have a cooling effect. Another thing they could use is uh, uh, coordinate coordinate with the Department of Treasury. They have a FinCEN where they could track money flows, and then with
That's
AI
important.
technology, they could determine, well, if all these concrete blocks are bought, and well, let's see where it came from, it was, and they could use AI technology just to find how many, where did all the blocks are bought and from who, if it's cash and if it's or credit, and if it's cash, and then look at the security cameras. So there's ways to kind of deconstruct the usual suspects.
These
And
people don't work. They don't have jobs. This is their job. They're the mobs, and they're
well,
migratory.
I know, but the people who spend the money to supply them, there's ways to go about it. Go ahead, Harrison.
Yeah, and you're correct. Yes, Harrison.
I'm glad you mentioned the SEIU, especially as you started out in the context of California. It was Jerry Brown back in the 70s who started collective bargaining with SEIU and the state. which was one of the many things that started California rolling downhill. The whole idea behind collective bargaining and trade unions, which were initially a healthy safeguard against the early abuses of industrialization, is that you've got two theoretical adversaries. You have owners and you have workers. So they're going to get together in a collective bargaining process and work out a middle ground between what the workers want and what the owners are willing to give them. As you said, the SEIU, they're public employees. And as you noted, they donate 90% of their money, 99% to liberals. And bear in mind, of course, that the members don't have any say in that. The union decides where that's going to go. So it inverts the whole concept of collective bargaining. You don't have two adversaries on each side of the table trying to reach a healthy compromise. You have politicians on one side and the people who put them in the office on the other, telling them basically what they're going to get. In other words, their demands are going to be automatically delivered. So, I'm against the whole notion of the SEIU having collective bargaining rights to begin with. If you think about it, it doesn't make sense. What kind of bargaining, what kind of back and forth is going to go on between the people who are making demands and the people who they owe their livelihood to, the ones who put them in office?
Yeah.
Harrison,
and we take that for granted.
Yeah.
But if
Quid
we're
pro quo.
if we're old enough, and many of us are, that hasn't always been so. That was a nifty little inversion of logic and reality by Jerry Brown back when he was governor of California. And it should never have been implemented, and it should be taken apart.
Yeah.
There's no reason for it.
Raul, you wanted to touch on that.
No. That's a subject for another day, man. But I mean, there's a reason why. It doesn't make any sense where in America today, the only place that unions really dominate anymore are in the public sector, right? I mean, all these government-sponsored, that's why it's so difficult for Trump to get rid of people in Washington, D.C., because everybody, including the diplomats, have their own union, right? To make sure that they don't, get fired that easily, and that, and that I think is what's upsetting so many people in Washington D.C. is because, for the longest time you got a government job and you were like in Lake Flint, man. I mean, you were there for the rest of your life. Nobody could get you out of your job. So long as you showed up for work and had a pulse, you would little by little, make more money and retire with a very nice pension at the end of 30 or 40 years. And now all that's coming to an end. Anyway.
Yeah, well, so long as you showed up for work, we just found out from Doge was redefined as 1 day a week. Showed up for work. The other thing too, with the Teamsters. Now you may think, okay, the Teamsters are not the SEIU. Clearly, they're not. But I'll give you an example. One would think, well, those unions are mostly active and they do their damage mostly in blue states. Yeah, that's true. But we experienced for 2 years problems with them in Miami Beach. We have an annual convention for the Dental Association, the local branch in Miami. It's called the South Florida District Dental Association. We would have an annual convention, and it used to be on the Fontainebleau. Then many years we went to the Hyatt, but then the Hyatt, since they're too wrapped up with UM, and James L. Knight Center, et cetera, kind of booted us out. So we had to go back to Fontainebleau. And what we found out, when you do a convention, there's like the exhibitors, there's tables and, dental companies selling their wares. There's all kinds. They bring in equipment. It's a lot of shit. They got to unload a lot of trucks. Well, guess what? You couldn't touch any of that. If a guy showed up from like a big dental supplier, no, leave that truck right there. The Teamsters have to come and unload it.
Of course, yeah. Teamsters, sure.
And it was slow as beans, and it was very, very disruptive. We left after 2 years and went elsewhere.
There was a journalist, a very highly regarded journalist back in the 60s, named Murray Kempton, who wrote for the New York Times, and he was an avowed, a self-professed socialist, but he was a superb writer. He really had a gift for prose, and he was also a very temperamentally decent person. He was one of those guys who was kind of a true believer. He was just happened to be wrong. But even Murray Kempton, as a socialist, was against the closed union shop. He was for right to work. In other words, he was against forcing workers to join unions. Think about that, a socialist back in the 60s saying, no, I mean, we need unions, but you can't force workers to join them. So let that, sink in as to how far we've come.
Yeah.
As far as the, corruption, as long as we're telling amusing anecdotes, we're all old enough to remember The Godfather. That was 50 years ago now. And the transportation captain on The Godfather, this is in 1970s dollars, made $750,000 on that film. This was the head Teamster driver, because they did so much night for day shooting that he was on the clock all the time, collecting double, triple, quadruple overtime. That's how effective the Teamsters are.
And that's why movies are made in Georgia and Florida and the Carolinas, et cetera, and
That's
Europe.
right.
Louisiana.
That's right.
Louisiana. No, hell, they're doing it in Slovenia. They're doing it in not Ukraine, but they're filming in Czech Republic, and that's why.
Yeah, Vancouver. Yeah, you name it.
It's cheaper.
And listen, two of my brothers are Teamsters, and they work hard. But I remember one of them, the day he got into the union, his disposable income skyrocketed. So I mean,
Oh boy, that's collective bargaining.
Well, Trump got a record number. For what it's worth, Sean, what's his name, O'Brien, did not endorse either party, either candidate, and Trump got not from the leadership, of course, but from the rank and file. He got an unprecedented record number of votes, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, the AFL-CIO endorsed Nixon back in '72. I mean, that's a whole other topic for another day. But I am with you 1,000% on the SEIU. I mean, private industry unions are necessary, but they shouldn't be mandatory. And workers should have the right to say where their dues are going, and they should never be told how to vote.
I used to get lectured by ignorant people. Well, who are you to talk about unions? You're a member of the ADA. And I would say, hold on a second, moron. The ADA is a membership organization for benefits. It is not a union. You do not have to be an ADA member to practice dentistry. You have to be a licensed dentist in your state, and every state issues licenses. You can practice perfectly the same as I do without being a member. And the reason we have, back then anyway, a 65, 70% market share is because we provide services where it's a worthwhile membership for what you get. That's why we're members, not because it is compulsory. And I would that's how I would shut that down. Did you want to go on, Harrison, to expound on what we're talking about tonight, the constitutional crisis? Either you or Raul or Marcus.
No, I'm going to forfeit my topic. I was going to talk about the war between Thailand and Cambodia, but in the interim, since I chose it, they've actually brokered a ceasefire.
As has Africa.
But you know what's really interesting, and this is very relevant to what we were talking about earlier. Trump did it using tariffs. He told him, but he did the same approach that he's been using. He started with a high bar, and he also brought Indonesia in to help broker this. Indonesia had started at 36%, but they negotiated and worked it down to 20%. And
Yeah.
Trump said to Thailand and Cambodia, and they're fighting over boundary issues that had their origins back in the early 1800s. But he said to them, he goes, "You keep fighting, your tariffs are gonna stay at 36%," and they immediately signed a ceasefire. So, that's a callback to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the tariff setting falling under international relations, national security, executive powers. And it's working. I mean, 300,000 people were displaced by this war, and he brought it to an end like that. And I
With
can't
all,
for the life of me understand really why people hate him so much.
well, it's,
I
yeah,
just
it's
don't get
insanity. So that means he's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Right, Harrison?
it. Not in our lifetime.
Yes, Marcus.
Yeah, just going back to your point, I take like a military perspective on, how do you deal with the anarchist mobs? Basically, it would come down to federal law enforcement because we're dealing with in interstate commerce. We're between a number of states, so it should be like a Department of Justice, FBI, but multi-agency tasking. I mean, you look at the IRS. If they're abusing their status as an NGO or a foundation or a charity, and they're using it for civil unrest, the IRS could revoke their status. The Treasury Department could look at like how money is being dispersed or used. The FBI could, just and the Department of Justice could do a criminal investigation. But then it should also segue to Congress as well. Like they should provide legislation to provide better guidelines and accountability with NGOs and charity organizations and foundations, because when we're dealing with the influx of the illegals, there's all these NGOs that was they were like fronts for the cartel, they were fronts for traffickers, and then there was no accountability where the kids went or where some of the women went.
Yeah. I mean, it's
And we
just a mere 300,000, that Mayorkas
and
couldn't
and,
account
and,
for.
and the federal government we funded it indirectly.
Yeah.
So there should be better accountability, but
Did
but
you want
also
to?
Yeah, and
but
we'll never know how many of these people actually died
Yeah,
at the
and
hands
God
of
knows what they're doing to them,
at
or
the
they're being
hands of the
trafficked and they're
cartels.
being
Yeah,
brutalized. Yeah,
yeah.
that's another topic for another night. Raul, did you want to touch on anything in closing before we
No,
wrap up for tonight?
no, man. I think it's time to call it an evening.
All right.
Well,
Well,
Raul, a belated happy birthday.
Ah, thank you, brother.
yes, yes. Well,
happy
everybody,
birthday.
remember, like and subscribe if you like what you heard. And we're going to be wrapping up very soon. So, thank you, gentlemen, for joining as usual and your terrific contributions. And we will say good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.